Welcome back to the Mentally Tough Teacher podcast. Today we're diving deep into something that I think every educator out there can relate to, learner-centered teaching. We're going to be exploring some pretty cool ideas from Mary Ellen Weimer's book, Learner-Centered Teaching, specifically Chapter 3, The Function of Content. And get ready to kind of shift your perspective a little bit, because one of the core concepts we're going to be unpacking is this idea of moving away from simply covering content and instead focusing on uncovering it.
Yeah, that's such a powerful distinction. It really gets to the heart of learner-centered teaching.
It does. It's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking that our job is just to deliver information, right? To cover as much ground as possible. We often feel this pressure to cram in every single detail, as if the more content we cover, the better our students will learn.
It's a pressure that a lot of us feel, and it often stems from our own experiences in graduate school, where the emphasis was very much on mastering a vast amount of content.
Right. I remember feeling like I was constantly drinking from a fire hose in grad school. But just because we were taught that way doesn't mean it's the best approach for our own students.
Absolutely. In fact, research suggests that this content-heavy approach can actually be detrimental to learning. For example, Ramsden studies showed that. While students can become very good at memorizing and regurgitating information for exams, they often lack a deep understanding of the material.
So they might ace the test, but then a week later, it's all gone.
Exactly. And that's a problem, especially in today's world where the amount of information is exploding and it's constantly evolving.
Yeah, it's almost like we're trying to prepare students for a world that no longer exists. This idea that we can give them a one-time dose of information and they'll be set for life. It just doesn't hold up anymore.
Right. We need to be equipping them with the skills to navigate this constantly changing landscape of knowledge, to become lifelong learners who can adapt and thrive in any environment.
Okay, so we need to move beyond simply transmitting information. But what does that actually look like in the classroom? Are we talking about teaching fewer facts and figures?
Well, it's not necessarily about teaching less content, but rather being more intentional about how we use content to foster those critical learning skills. For example, think about a skill like critical thinking. It's complex. It requires students to analyze information, identify biases, evaluate arguments, and form their own conclusions. We can't just assume they'll pick that up through osmosis.
Right, you're right. It's like hoping they'll learn to swim just by being thrown into the deep end. We need to provide explicit instruction and guidance, right?
Absolutely. And this is where Weimer's concept of the dual function of content comes in. She argues that content shouldn't just be about building knowledge, but also about developing these essential learning skills.
So the content becomes a vehicle for teaching students how to learn. Now that's interesting. Could you give me a specific example of what that might look like?
Sure. So imagine you're teaching a history lesson about a particular event. Instead of just presenting the facts, you could also teach students how to evaluate primary and secondary sources, how to identify bias, and how to construct a well-supported historical argument.
So they're learning about history, but they're also learning valuable skills that they can apply in any subject, and even in their lives outside of school.
Exactly. And the beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require a complete overhaul of your curriculum. It's about being more intentional about how you're already using content.
Okay, so we're using content to teach learning skills. That makes sense. But I'm already feeling a bit overwhelmed. I mean, I'm barely keeping up with covering the required material as it is. How am I supposed to squeeze in even more?
That's a valid concern, and it's a common one among educators. We often feel pressured to cover so much content that it feels impossible to add anything else. But Weimer suggests that it's not about adding more to our plates, but rather shifting our focus and being more strategic with how we use the content we're already teaching.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
It's about recognizing that content can serve a dual purpose, conveying knowledge and developing those essential learning skills. Instead of seeing them as separate entities, think about how you can seamlessly integrate them.
So it's less about adding more to our already overflowing plates and more about looking at our existing course content with a fresh perspective.
Exactly. For instance, remember that history lesson we discussed? By teaching students to evaluate sources, you're not just adding extra content, you're deepening their understanding of the historical event itself.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. It's about working smarter, not harder, right? But how do we even begin to make this shift? Where do we start?
Well, Weimer offers a wealth of practical strategies that can be easily implemented in any classroom. One that I find particularly effective is the two-sentence summary technique.
Okay, tell me more about that.
It's simple but powerful. At the end of each class session, give students 5 minutes to write a concise two-sentence summary of what they learned. This forces them to actively process the information, identify key takeaways, and put it into their own words.
That's a great idea. It's like a mini review session built right into the class. And it only takes 5 minutes.
Exactly, and you can even take it a step further by having students share their summaries with a partner or with the whole class. This adds a layer of accountability and encourages them to think critically about how they articulate their understanding.
I love that. It's a simple tweak that can make a big difference. What are some other strategies we can use?
Another one that Leimer suggests is having students create their own test questions.
Wait, really? Let the students write the test questions? That sounds a little risky.
It might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually a brilliant way to encourage deep engagement with the material. When students have to think about the content from the perspective of an assessor, it forces them to analyze what's truly important, identify potential areas of confusion, and consider different ways of approaching the topic.
I could see how that would really push them to think critically. Plus, they might even come up with some questions that are better than the ones I would have written.
Exactly, and you can always vet their questions before putting them on the actual exam. It's a win-win situation.
Okay, I'm convinced. Creating test questions is definitely going on my list of learner-centered strategies to try. What else does Weimer recommend?
Another powerful tool that Weimer highlights is peer learning. We can leverage the collective wisdom and experience of our students by creating opportunities for them to learn from each other.
I've always been a fan of incorporating peer learning into my classes. What are some specific ways we can do that effectively?
One simple but effective strategy is to have students who have performed well on an exam or assignment share their study strategies or approaches with their classmates. This not only helps the students who are struggling, but also reinforces the understanding of the students who are already doing well.
It's like creating a culture of support and collaboration in the classroom. I love it.
And don't forget the amazing resources we have in our learning centers. We can partner with Learning Center professionals to provide students with targeted support in areas like note-taking, study skills, and time management.
Yes, our learning centers are such valuable assets and often underutilized. We should definitely be encouraging our students to take advantage of the services they offer.
Absolutely. It's all about working together to create a supportive learning environment where students feel empowered to succeed.
Okay, so we've talked about several practical strategies: the two-sentence summary, creating test questions, peer learning, and partnering with learning centers. These all sound great. But I'm wondering, how do we help students become more aware of their own learning processes? I think that's a key piece of the puzzle.
That's a great question. Fostering metacognition, that is, students' awareness and understanding of their own learning, is a crucial aspect of learner-centered teaching. Weimer provides some excellent strategies for promoting self-awareness, one of which is a simple reflective writing assignment.
I'm always up for incorporating more reflective writing. Tell me more about this particular assignment.
You can ask students to write a short paper identifying their favorite and most effective learning strategies. This encourages them to think critically about how they learn best, what works for them, and what doesn't.
This could be especially helpful for students who might not have even thought about their learning process before. It gives them a framework for understanding their own strengths and weaknesses as learners.
Exactly. Another powerful tool is incorporating learning logs. These are journals where students can reflect on their learning experiences, both the successes and the challenges.
I've used learning logs in my classes before, and they've been really insightful. It's amazing to see the students' metacognitive growth over time as they become more aware of their own learning patterns and habits.
We can also encourage them to analyze their performance on exams and assignments, looking for patterns in the types of questions they missed or the errors they made. This helps them move beyond simply seeing a grade and instead view these assessments as opportunities for growth and improvement.
It's about empowering them to take ownership of their learning and to become more strategic in their approach. I'm already starting to feel a shift in my own thinking about how I approach teaching, but I have to admit, making this transition to a more learner-centered approach feels a bit daunting. What are some of the challenges we might face, and how can we overcome them?
You're right, it's not always easy to shift our mindset and our practices, especially when we've been operating in a particular way for so long. One of the biggest challenges we often encounter is the question of content coverage.
Yeah, that's something I was thinking about too. How do we balance the need to cover essential content with the desire to prioritize these learning skills? It feels like there's never enough time to do it all.
Absolutely. And Weimer acknowledges this as a complex issue with no easy answers. It requires careful consideration, thoughtful prioritization, and sometimes difficult decisions about what to cut.
Cutting content can be a tough pill to swallow, especially when we feel pressure from our departments or institutions to cover a certain amount of material. It can feel like we're sacrificing rigor or shortchanging our students.
That's a valid concern, and it's a conversation we need to be having within our departments and institutions. We need to advocate for a shift in priorities emphasizing the importance of developing those lifelong learning skills alongside content knowledge.
It's about changing the culture of teaching and learning, and that takes time and effort, but it's a change worth fighting for. What are some other challenges we might encounter?
Another challenge we often face is addressing the varying skill levels and learning needs of our students. Not everyone comes to the classroom with the same background knowledge, learning styles, or skill sets.
That's definitely true. It could be a struggle to differentiate instruction and provide the appropriate level of support and challenge for each student. Any advice on how we can approach this effectively?
It's crucial to create a learning environment that is inclusive and supportive of all learners. This means providing differentiated instruction, offering a variety of learning activities, and being flexible in our approach. We can also leverage the power of peer learning and encourage students to support each other.
That makes sense. It's about creating a classroom community where everyone feels valued and respected, and where everyone has the opportunity to learn and grow.
Exactly. And it's also about recognizing that we, as educators, are also on a continuous journey of learning and growth. We don't have all the answers, and that's okay. It's about being open to new ideas, experimenting with different approaches, and constantly striving to improve our practice.
I love that. It's about embracing a growth mindset, not just for our students, but for ourselves as well. What a powerful reminder. Okay, I'm feeling inspired and ready to dive deeper into specific examples of learner-centered teaching practices. Okay, so we've talked about the big picture of learner-centered teaching, and we've explored some general strategies. Now let's get even more practical. With specific examples from Weimer's book, I'm excited to hear what else she has to offer.
Well, one example that she dives into is working with students on their textbook reading skills. It's something we often take for granted, assuming students inherently know how to effectively read a textbook. But that's not always the case.
I've definitely noticed that some of my students struggle with textbook reading. They either highlight everything, which doesn't really help them focus on what's important, or they just skim the surface and miss the key concepts altogether. What does Weimer suggest we do about this?
Well, she proposes a developmental approach, starting with simple activities and gradually increasing the complexity. For instance, let's say you're teaching a biology class and you've assigned a chapter on cell structure. Instead of just telling them to read the chapter, you could guide them through the process.
Okay, I like where this is going. What would that guidance look like?
You could start by having them individually underline key terms as they read, then have them pair up and compare what they underlined, discussing why they made those choices. This seemingly simple activity encourages them to focus on the most important information and starts building those critical reading muscles.
That's a fantastic idea. It's so simple, yet so effective. It gets them thinking critically about the text and engaging with each other. What are some other ways we can support their textbook reading?
As they become more proficient, you can introduce more challenging tasks. For example, have them analyze the author's argument, or connect the reading to other course materials, maybe even bringing in journal events or real-world examples.
That's a great way to deepen their understanding and help them see the relevance of what they're learning. So we're scaffolding those skills, providing support and guidance along the way, rather than just throwing them into the deep end with a dense textbook.
Exactly. And remember those last 5 minutes of class we talked about earlier, those can be utilized for student-led summaries of the today's lesson.
Yes, I love that idea. It's such a simple yet effective way to reinforce learning and get those brains working.
Exactly. You can have them write a 2-sentence summary, share key takeaways with a partner, or even come up with potential test questions based on the material. It's a great way to end the class on a high note and ensure that students are leaving with a clear understanding of the key concepts.
I can already picture myself trying that out in my next class. It's so much more engaging than just lecturing until the bell rings. What other practical tips does Weimer offer?
She also emphasizes the importance of collaborating with Learning Center professionals. They're incredible resources, and they can provide valuable support to both students and faculty.
I completely agree. Our Learning Center staff are absolute rock stars. They offer workshops, individual tutoring, and even classroom observations. How can we best utilize their expertise?
For example, you could invite a Learning Center staff member to class to observe students taking notes during a lecture. Then, in a subsequent session, the staff member could provide feedback on common note-taking errors and offer suggestions for improvement.
That's a fantastic idea. It's like having a personalized note-taking coach right there in the classroom.
Exactly, and it takes some of the pressure off of us as instructors, knowing that students are getting that targeted support in developing those essential study skills.
We've talked a lot about using content to teach learning skills. But how do we help students become more self-aware of their own learning processes? I think that's a key piece of the puzzle.
You're absolutely right. Fostering that metacognitive awareness is critical for helping students become more effective learners. One strategy Weimer recommends is having students reflect on their experiences with group work.
Group work can be such a valuable learning experience, but it can also be fraught with challenges, especially if students aren't aware of their own group work styles and tendencies.
Exactly. She suggests having students complete a group work inventory or write a reflective paper on their experiences, focusing on both their own contributions and those of their group members.
I can see how that would be incredibly insightful. It encourages them to think about their role in the group, their communication style, their strengths, and their areas for growth.
Precisely. It helps them develop those interpersonal skills and become more effective collaborators, which are essential skills both in the classroom and in the real world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into learner-centered teaching, I think the key takeaway is that it's not about throwing out content or abandoning rigor. It's about being intentional and thoughtful about how we use content to foster both knowledge acquisition and the development of essential learning skills. It's about empowering our students to become active, engaged, and self-directed learners. And it's about embracing the fact that we, as educators, are also on a continuous journey of learning and growth.
I couldn't have said it better myself. We're all learners in this journey. And by embracing these principles, we can create a more dynamic and fulfilling learning experience for both ourselves and our students.
This has been such an enlightening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new toolkit of strategies to try out in my classroom. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure. I'm always excited to talk about learner-centered teaching and the transformative power it has on education.
And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this deep dive into learner-centered teaching, be sure to give this episode a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on future episodes. Hit that notification bell so you'll be alerted when we post new content. And as always, thank you for listening to the Mentally Tough Teacher Podcast.